On the day our biological child was laid to rest, my husband flew off to Thailand to host a birthday celebration for his mistress, while my mother-in-law took everything I owned and even threatened to tarnish my reputation. As I was about to end my life in a fit of despair, a truck barreled toward me and everything seemed to freeze in time. Suddenly, a large screen appeared, playing the memories of my first half of life like a movie. When I opened my eyes, I realized I had been reborn, holding the urn containing our child's ashes. The moment the truck struck me, the ashes were scattered into the air. I desperately reached out to catch them, but my hands grasped nothing. My body slammed into the ground, and the sharp pain from my broken bones twisted my face in agony. In my mind, I heard the voice of the judge declaring, insufficient evidence. The defendant, Henry, is not guilty. Henry had first taped our child's mouth shut and left him in the park, where he was found frozen in the river, his tiny body filled with water. I could not fathom how Henry could act so cruelly. Even a tiger wouldn't harm its cubs. I screamed at Henry, demanding an explanation, but he shoved me away, irritated, and tugged at his tie, saying, "You gave birth to an autistic child. If he had been normal, would he have been able to walk to the river and fall in? He's just a lunatic." His cold, heartless tone only made me slap him, unable to think of anything other than calling him a beast. On the day of our child's funeral, Henry went to Thailand for his mistress's birthday. I looked at photos on her WeChat moments, seeing her surrounded by men holding bouquets, all celebrating her. My hands shook so violently that I swallowed a handful of tranquilizers. The stress caused me to lose clumps of hair, and I could only sleep with sleeping pills, waking up feeling like a ghost. Before the court hearing, I intentionally packed a fruit knife in my bag, determined that if the law failed to punish him, I would do it myself. As I lay in a pool of blood, I saw Henry approaching, and as I tried to tell him to leave, I coughed up a mouthful of blood. Time seemed to stop again, and another screen appeared, replaying my past life, but it suddenly cut off as if someone turned it off. "Go to hell," I whispered. When I opened my eyes again, I found myself lying in a hospital obstetrics ward, and the date was March 4th, 2021, at 12:05. My baby had been diagnosed with issues since the prenatal checkups. The doctor had asked if I wanted to keep the baby, and most people recommended an abortion. But Henry had convinced me to keep it, showing me the ultrasound and telling me, "He's a little life, Diana. He's survived so much in your womb. Are you really going to let him go?" He assured me that no matter the baby's problems, we would face them together. Henry, a heavy smoker, knew how difficult it had been for me to conceive, but he was adamant that we keep the child, even though the baby might have complications. I yanked the needle from my hand and sat up, covering my eyes with my swollen hands and crying. I called the doctor to discharge me. The first thing I did after leaving the hospital was go to find William. I stood outside his door for 2 hours, and when he saw me, he frowned. "You look so pale. Didn't I tell you to wait at a coffee shop?" I shook my head and asked, "I have a case I need your help with." He looked puzzled, then more seriously asked, "What case?" "A divorce case," I replied. His brows furrowed further. "Are you serious?" I forced a smile, then asked, "As a lawyer, is it okay for you to accompany a client to have an abortion?" William had been a university classmate of Henry, and while he and Henry were close, I had avoided too much contact with him after marrying Henry. However, William had gone abroad early for a project, so I had lost touch with him even more. Back at the hospital, the sterile smell of disinfectant and the cold air made me uncomfortable. William asked if I was sure about my decision. I nodded, and he handled the discharge procedures. As I was wheeled into the abortion room, my teeth chattered in fear. The doctor told me to curl up, and I was given anesthesia. While I waited, I saw an image of my baby on the monitor. I began to cry uncontrollably. My child, who loved to paint and often retreated into his own quiet world, was misunderstood by Henry, who had taped his mouth shut. I couldn't comprehend the pain my child must have felt while drowning. I wished I could have taken his place. Beyond autism, my child also had a heart defect, which meant he couldn't play or exercise like other children. Bringing him into this world had condemned him to suffering, and I regretted not being able to give him a healthy body. When the procedure was over, I was exhausted and weak. William came to check on me, his hand halfway to my forehead, before he withdrew it as his phone vibrated repeatedly. "Don't you want to answer that?" I asked. William explained it was a work project, but he had already turned it down. "Don't worry about it," he said. I looked into his eyes and thanked him. "It's my duty to help my clients," he replied. I didn't want to stay in the hospital any longer, so I went to William's apartment. On the way, I noticed his phone's search history. Can abortion cause death? How much rest after an abortion? What should a woman eat after an abortion? When he asked if Henry had contacted me, I replied, I told him I was on a trip to relax. In my previous life, I had been so sensible, even telling Henry that I was just on a trip while I dealt with the pregnancy. Henry had been focused on his career, and I didn't want to distract him. William didn't ask any more questions and turned up the heat in the car. I was so exhausted that I quickly fell asleep. When I woke up, I was lying in William's bed, surrounded by the cold, lonely black and white decor of his apartment. I heard William talking to someone on the phone, arranging for an aunt to make soup for a patient. I drifted off to sleep again, only to wake to the smell of something burning. William soon appeared, bringing in a pot of food I didn't recognize. I couldn't understand why his face was filled with irritation. I followed the recipe perfectly, yet something had gone wrong. If you don't want to eat it, I'll just throw it out. The aunt will be here this afternoon, and she's making something you can actually eat. Looking at his frustrated expression, I asked, Did you find the aunt? I found her earlier, he replied. I'm just not used to eating food from outside. William was always like this. He cared deeply about others, but was too stubborn to admit it. I gave a soft hum, not exposing him. In the afternoon, the aunt arrived. William mentioned a lot of things to her in private, and once he left for work, she turned to me and said, Your boyfriend is so good to you. He told me not to do this or that. I've never seen someone so attentive. I paused before responding, He's not my boyfriend. I'd stayed in the apartment for nearly 2 weeks. When I felt well enough, I decided to leave. William didn't try to stop me. Are you sure? He asked. I nodded. Yes, I've sent you the agreement you wanted. If there's anything you need, just call me. I left the apartment and returned to Henry's family. I had lost a lot of weight and hadn't gained much during my pregnancy. So my mother-in-law didn't notice that the baby was gone. When she saw me back, she immediately approached. Diana, where did you go on your trip? Did you buy me a gift? No, I replied, slightly surprising her. You used to always get me something when you went away. Why didn't you this time? I didn't feel like buying anything, I answered. She nodded, not too bothered, and then asked, Diana, I'm a bit short on cash lately. Could you lend me some? My mother-in-law was always looking for a way to get money from me. Since I had married Henry, she never dared to ask him, always coming to me instead. I ran a design studio, and while I didn't make a lot, it was enough for my needs. Yet my mother-in-law would always find reasons to borrow money, claiming it was for medical expenses, though I knew she used it to support her brother. I looked at her, asking, What's it for this time? She hesitated, then quickly responded, I've been having some leg pain recently. I saw a massage device I really like, but it costs 10,000 yuan. Diana, since Mother's Day is coming up, could you consider it as a gift? The way she called herself Mom sounded so fake to me. I lost my own mother at a young age, and after marrying Henry, I had tried to treat my mother-in-law as my own. But she was never satisfied, constantly using me for her benefit. I gave a soft hum and handed her a credit card. There's no limit. Spend as much as you need. The password is 3 sixes followed by 38. Buy whatever you want for Mother's Day. When she saw the bank card, her face lit up and she smiled widely. Diana is truly a thoughtful daughter-in-law. I didn't love you in vain. What would you like to eat? I'll cook it for you. Just stew a pig's trotter for me, I said, knowing it would take a long time. Henry had said he needed to work late, so I brought the stew to him. He had just been promoted to vice president at his company and was quite popular, especially with young women. His mistress, Elizabeth, was a receptionist, just 22 years old, and she was sweet-looking. At that time, they were still in the early stages of their relationship, too cautious to be obvious. It wasn't until after the baby's diagnosis that they became open about it. I arrived at the office just in time to see Elizabeth sharing a bowl of seafood porridge with Henry, using the same spoon. Elizabeth noticed me first, and Henry quickly dropped the spoon in shock. Diana, why are you here? He asked. I brought you dinner. Don't you love the pig's trotter stew Mom made for you? I placed the lunchbox on his desk and glanced at the porridge. I'm afraid I came at the wrong time. You must be full from the seafood porridge. Henry hurriedly took the lunchbox and winked at Elizabeth. She left, leaving Henry and me alone. He dumped the porridge into the trash. The porridge from the restaurant can't compare to the stew Mom made. And you brought it yourself. He gently helped me sit at his desk. You're still pregnant. Stay home and rest. Don't run around. If you get tired and something happens to the baby, I'll be the one to blame, he said, making a slitting gesture across his throat. I said nothing, staring at him. At that moment, he seemed like nothing more than a clown. Honey, why are you looking at me like that? He asked, uncomfortable under my gaze. I said, Henry, when we got married, you promised me you would always treat me well and never betray me. He awkwardly coughed. Yes. Then let's sign an agreement, I suggested, pulling out the marital loyalty agreement and placing it neatly in front of him. Henry glanced at the seafood porridge in the trash and shrugged. Don't overthink it. Elizabeth just ordered extra takeout, and there wasn't another spoon. Yes. She's quite attractive, isn't she? I continued. He assured me, no matter how pretty she is, she's not as beautiful as you. You're the most beautiful in the world. His flattery made me feel sick. Isn't her English good? Would she be interested in being my tutor on weekends? I want to learn English. Henry paused before replying, You'll have to ask Elizabeth. I can't make that decision. In my previous life, it had been Henry who invited her to our home to tutor me, but not in English. Instead, she helped me learn how to care for an autistic child, as she had a relative with autism. When I told her I wanted to learn English, Elizabeth agreed without hesitation. Sister Diana, when should we start? This week? I printed out the agreement and sent it to William, who messaged me asking for information about Henry's property. Over the years, Henry had accumulated many stocks and funds, and besides the house we lived in, he had other properties hidden from me. I bought several cameras online and placed them in concealed locations. I also purchased a travel ticket for my mother-in-law for the weekend. When Elizabeth arrived, Henry and I were alone. I asked him to wash some fruit for her. As he handed the fruit to Elizabeth, she smiled. Thank you, President Henry. Don't call me President Henry when it's not working hours, he replied. Elizabeth's ears turned slightly pink as she nodded. But my real goal wasn't about the tutoring. After sitting for a while, I complained, My back hurts. I'll step out onto the balcony to get some fresh air. Henry responded, Honey, your mom's not home. I'll stew a fish for you for lunch. Elizabeth looked at him in surprise. I didn't know President Henry could cook. Henry wasn't pleased with the title. Just call me Henry. Elizabeth blushed and turned her gaze to me. I'm so envious of Sister Diana. If only I had a husband who could cook. At lunch, Elizabeth seemed a bit hesitant and got a fishbone stuck in her throat. Henry quickly jumped up to pat her back and handed her some water. I watched him flurry around and laughed. He probably realized something was off and immediately stopped. I teased, How could you get a fishbone stuck at your age? Elizabeth rubbed her neck apologetically. Sorry, Sister Diana. I made a fool of myself. I don't know how to eat fish. Someone always peeled it for me before, I replied. Then let Henry peel it for you. Elizabeth quickly waved her hands. No, Sister Diana, I couldn't. In my previous life, Elizabeth always had Henry peel fish or shrimp for her. She wouldn't even pick up her own food. Once, she even sent me a video with a caption that read, Diana, Brother Henry won't peel fish or shrimp for you, but he will for me. I replied sarcastically, How touching, Henry peeling fish and shrimp for an armless, disabled person. Despite my response, deep down, I knew I had lost, completely. Shaking off the memory, I noticed Henry staring at me with a blank expression. In the evening, Henry put his arm around my shoulder. Honey, if you want to learn English, I'll find another tutor. I feel uncomfortable with Elizabeth here. Why? I asked. I don't know, just uncomfortable. Could it be because your husband is so handsome that Elizabeth might have feelings for him? I remarked, noticing the strong smell of cigarette smoke on him. I frowned. What about you? Henry snuggled closer. I only love my wife. No other woman is as wonderful as you. Honey, you have great taste choosing me as your husband. I felt nauseous from his greasy words and pushed him away. You smell like cigarettes. Henry remembered something and nodded. Right, you're pregnant and can't stand cigarette smoke. I'll go take a shower. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law was enjoying her trip. I suggested a software to her. Now, your brother is short on cash, right? This software lets you do tasks to earn commissions with compound interest, multiplying by 10 times. My friend made a lot of money from it, or you can team up with your brother. Then, your brother can buy a house and car for his son, and you won't need to borrow from me anymore. My mother-in-law was skeptical, so I sent her the instructions. Try a 20 yuan task first and see if you get cash back. She completed the task and received a 40 yuan return. Excited, she messaged me, Diana, this software is great. I've earned dozens of yuan already. I replied, then keep going. Watching the notifications about her increasing credit card spending, I gave a slight smile. On the fourth Sunday, Elizabeth came to tutor me again, but I wasn't home. I sent her a message. I'm out. Wait at home. I'll be back soon. I accessed the surveillance and saw her waiting at home. Then, Henry came out to cut fruit for her, and they went into the kitchen. Elizabeth accidentally cut her hand while trying to help. Henry put on a bandage for her, and the two of them casually brushed against each other. On the surveillance footage, it was clear that Elizabeth was nervous, while Henry was at ease. He even teased her palm with his finger. Elizabeth took a shy step back. Henry said something, then gently brushed her hair, before grabbing her chin and lowering his head to kiss her. The kiss lingered, and I could tell that Henry had been craving it for some time, especially since he couldn't touch me during my pregnancy. Watching the scene on the screen, I smiled again. Everything was falling into place. When I returned home, Elizabeth's face was flushed, and the air smelled more like my perfume. Henry had used it to cover up the situation, afraid I'd notice. You're finally back, honey. I've been waiting so long, Henry greeted me. I went to buy something. Then you can have your English lesson, he added. I'm a bit tired. I'll go rest for a bit, he said, before heading to the bedroom. I turned to Elizabeth and asked, Isn't it tiring to tutor me every weekend? Elizabeth shook her head. No, Sister Diana. It's not tiring at all. Henry even cuts fruit for me. You and Henry are both so nice to me. In the blink of an eye, another half-month passed. I bought a fake pregnancy belly online and reasonably suggested to Henry that we sleep in separate beds because his snoring disturbed me. He agreed. Over the past few weeks, Henry and Elizabeth had been enjoying their time together, without restraint. Sometimes, when I went to the balcony for fresh air, I'd see them acting overtly affectionate. They thought I wouldn't notice. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law returned from her trip earlier than expected, likely for a reason. As soon as she got home, she grabbed me. Diana, that software doesn't work anymore. When I invested 100 or 200 yuan, I got cash back of several hundred. But now when I invested 100,000 or 200,000 yuan, I got nothing back, I asked. Why don't you try again? She did, but was upset and angry. My brother tried too. He invested 200,000 yuan, and it's all gone. We can't get it back. I asked what happened. She grabbed my hand and demanded, Diana, you have to get the money back for me. You recommended that software, and you're responsible. I nodded. Well, if nothing else works, let's call the police. After some thought, she agreed, Yes, we have to call the police. I took her to the police station, explained the situation, and watched as she cried and shouted that she must get her money back. I stood by, indifferent, as her eyes turned red and swollen from crying. After leaving the station, she said, Diana, how did your friend recommend this to you? This thing is just harmful. I replied, You're right. She continued, What should I do now? If my son finds out, he'll be really angry. Then don't let him know, I suggested. She added, Diana, could you lend me more money? Isn't the credit card enough? No, it's not enough. My brother's son, your cousin, is getting married. Could you lend me a bit more? She asked. Sure, but this time you have to write an IOU. Not just for this debt, but for everything you owe me, I replied. I planned to total up everything she had borrowed from me. My mother-in-law never took such things seriously, always thinking that because I was her daughter-in-law, my money was hers. So she signed the IOU without hesitation. Eventually, Henry realized one of his credit cards had been overdrawn. This card was linked to an old phone number that I had temporarily taken over. He couldn't buy a necklace for Elizabeth because all his accounts were frozen. Henry came to me asking, Diana, did you use my card? I was looking at a design I was about to submit to a client. It wasn't me, it was your mom. Henry was furious. Yeah, you knew mom spends recklessly and you still gave her the credit card? I turned to him. Your mom asked me for money. As a daughter-in-law, of course I gave it to her. But you shouldn't have given her the card. Over the years, she's asked me for a lot. Should I use my own money to support her? Henry was speechless. Seriously, Diana, never do this again. I didn't respond. An hour later, Henry went to see William. After their conversation, William came to meet me at a coffee shop. His brow furrowed deeply. Henry told me there's a case in his company he wants you to take. Before he left, he also mentioned a friend of his wants to get a divorce and asked, The next day, I saw that Henry's friend wanted advice on how to divide his property in a way that would benefit him, as his friend's wife was pregnant, and he also wanted to fight for custody. I couldn't help but laugh. In my past life, when the baby was just born, Henry pretended to be a responsible father, but as soon as the child was diagnosed with autism, every time he looked at the baby, it felt as though he was facing an enemy. If the law had allowed it, Henry would have likely strangled the baby without hesitation. I said to William, "I don't want to wait any longer." William handed me a marital property agreement saying, "This is for you. Keep all the messages between Henry and Elizabeth, and save the receipts for the gifts he gave her." I accepted the agreement from William, thanking him. He stood up and said, "Before we proceed with the legal steps, it wouldn't be appropriate for us to meet again." I nodded. As he turned to leave, I suddenly remembered something. I pulled a key from my pocket and handed it to him. "This is the key to your apartment. You gave it to me a while ago and I forgot to return it." He looked at it, then replied, "The lock has been changed. It's no use now." Without another word, he turned and left. Watching him go, I felt a wave of nostalgia. I seemed to be transported back to my university days. Henry had always been outgoing, while William was reserved. The two were such contrasting personalities. William never openly expressed concern for me or took any initiative, while Henry was constantly proactive, always checking on me, sending flowers, and bringing me food. On the day of graduation, Henry had been drunk and confessed his love for me impulsively, with everyone around joining in the celebration. I didn't remember exactly when it happened, but later someone told me that William had liked me too. However, he wasn't good with words, and often said the opposite of what he meant. They explained that when he wasn't sure if he could bring happiness to someone, he didn't want to make promises. He had a tough background, and probably he didn't confess his feelings sooner because he wanted to be in a better place before offering happiness. At the time, I didn't feel much because I was deeply involved with Henry, but now, thinking back, it makes my eyes feel sore. William, who had become a leader in his field, was still single. Henry once laughed at him, saying, "With your current status, you could have any woman you want." William simply replied, "I'm not interested." Watching William leave the coffee shop, I felt a mix of emotions. The next day, I presented the marital property agreement to Henry. He glanced at it and asked, "What's this about, honey?" I replied, "It's nothing. I've just been seeing a lot of divorce stories recently, and it made me uneasy." Henry reassured me, "Honey, you're overthinking it. Even if everyone else gets divorced, I won't. You know me well by now, after all these years of marriage." I placed my hand on my stomach. "Are you really not going to sign it?" Henry hesitated before responding, "It's not that I don't want to sign. It's just that you're springing this on me, and I'm a little confused." I stared at him. "A few days ago, the doctor called to remind me to get medication to support the pregnancy. If you don't want to sign, then I might have to reconsider whether to keep the baby." Henry cut me off, looking serious. "Didn't we already agree to keep the child? I'm in my mid-30s, and it's not easy for me to have a child." I asked him, "So, will you sign?" His gaze sharpened. "Do you really want me to sign that badly?" "Yes," I replied. Henry raised his eyebrows, picked up the pen, and signed the agreement. Then, without a word, he turned and slammed the bedroom door shut. When Elizabeth came to tutor me again that weekend, I made an excuse to go downstairs and buy some fruit. I overheard their conversation as I passed by. Henry said, "My wife might have noticed something. She's been acting differently lately." Elizabeth, looking worried, asked, "Well, what should we do?" Henry replied, "It's fine. She can't do anything to me. If it weren't for the baby, I would have kicked her to the curb long ago." Elizabeth whispered, "I can also give you a baby. We've been together for a while now. Why haven't you gotten me pregnant? Why don't we go to the hospital and check?" Henry, clearly disgusted by the idea, responded, "I hate hospitals. They're full of quacks. I just smoke too much. There's nothing else wrong with me." Instead of asking William, Henry contacted one of William's lawyer friends. The legal community wasn't large, so word quickly reached William's ears. He told me that Henry wanted to transfer the marital property. I put it together. Henry didn't have many relatives. He had converted most of his assets into real estate and other easily liquidated investments, and transferred them to my mother-in-law's name. My mother-in-law wasn't very clever. Lately, she had been going to the police station every day or pestering me for more money. She told me, "Diana, you've really ruined me. The hundreds of thousands I borrowed from you and your brother are still unreturned. If you don't help me, I won't be able to survive." I responded, "Mom, what are you talking about? Of course, I'll help. She asked, "What should we do next? Can you come up with something?" My mother-in-law's brother's son wasn't a very nice person. It was a miracle that he found a girlfriend. The girl's family was asking for a dowry of 500,000 Wayne, a significant sum for many families. My mother-in-law's brother had been complaining constantly to her, and she was very worried. I said, "Mom, it's not that I don't want to help, but I really don't have any money left. How about this? Henry gave you some things recently. You can take them to the bank and use them as collateral." My mother-in-law protested, "That won't work. My son will scold me to death if he finds out." I reassured her, "He won't find out. When the money from my design studio comes through, I'll make it up to you." She smiled. "Diana is such a good daughter-in-law, always thinking of Mom." I added, "But you still need to write an IOU. It's for our records, so everything matches up when it's checked. We're family, so we won't force you to pay it back. After your nephew from your eldest brother's family gets married, you can slowly pay me back, okay?" Okay, my mother-in-law replied. "Diana is still the best, unlike my awful son." In my previous life, before Henry wanted a divorce, he had given my mother-in-law many ideas to empty out my property using any means possible. This time, before Henry and I had our fallout, he hadn't mentioned these plans to her yet. My mother-in-law loved gossip, and he feared that if I found out, I might reconsider keeping the baby. Henry's company had arranged a team-building trip to Thailand, and I suggested to him that I wanted to go too. Initially, he was hesitant, but after I insisted repeatedly, he eventually agreed. "Honey, you're overthinking this," he reassured me. "I'm just going on a team-building trip to Thailand, nothing else." I responded, "I'm not overthinking. I just want to use this opportunity to travel to Thailand with you." The day before we were set to leave for Thailand, I messaged William, and he replied with a single word, "Okay." Thailand was full of sunshine and beaches, and everyone was having a great time. I deliberately got Henry drunk and unlocked the chat records on his phone. The crude and disgusting messages between him and Elizabeth came into view. Henry had called her baby and sent pictures with captions like, "Was hubby great yesterday? Baby, would you wear this and show it to hubby? Baby, you're so sweet. The stinky woman at home is so annoying." The messages were recent and he had deleted the older ones, probably to avoid me discovering them. His phone was protected by his fingerprint, showing that he was being extra cautious. I took pictures of the chat history and saved them, then returned his phone to its original place. I remembered that on the day my child was buried, Henry had hosted a birthday party for Elizabeth at a Thai restaurant. Coincidentally, we were in Thailand now. I decided to let Elizabeth experience what it was like to be surrounded by Thai models again. As the trip neared its end, I suggested we visit a Thai model-themed restaurant, and Elizabeth eagerly agreed. Henry wanted to join, but I told him he couldn't. "This is a day just for us women," I said. Henry, sounding a little put off, replied, "Aren't I better looking than those Thai models?" "Honey, don't you think I'm enough for you to look at?" I wasn't sure if he was speaking to me or to Elizabeth. I responded, "Not enough. Since I married you, I haven't had my own space. I just want to visit a place. It won't cost me anything." Elizabeth giggled, and Henry, looking helpless, said, "Fine, go ahead then." Elizabeth and I went to the restaurant, where we were surrounded by handsome men and a beautiful view. Elizabeth was ecstatic. I called the Thai models over and told them to take good care of her. Noticing her bag in the corner with her phone inside, I quietly left the place. As I walked through the streets of the foreign country, it began to drizzle unexpectedly. Looking up, I saw an umbrella over my head, and when I looked further, I saw that it was William. "What a coincidence," I said. "I have a case for a client that required me to come here," he explained. "So, why are you here?" I asked. "As you said, just a coincidence," he replied. William took me to a seaside bar with a perfect view of the sunset. The warm afterglow of the setting sun bathed us, and we sat there in silence for a long while. Eventually, I turned to William and said, "Do you know that for a while I kept asking myself why I married Henry? Why didn't I see his true nature under the disguise? I regret it so much that I almost wanted to slap myself." William replied, "A skilled hunter won't reveal he's a hunter before he's close to his prey." I turned my gaze toward the glowing sea, reflecting on Henry and Elizabeth. They're really a perfect match, both scumbags. Back at the hotel, Henry told me that Elizabeth had gone missing. "Did you call the police?" I asked. "You went to the Time model-themed restaurant with her. Why did you come back alone?" Henry grabbed my arm, his face showing frustration with a hint of violence. "Diana, If anything happens to Elizabeth, you'll be held responsible. Elizabeth was found at the hospital, trembling. Henry immediately pulled her into his arms, ignoring the stares of the people around. He comforted her, saying, "Don't be afraid, honey. I'm here." Elizabeth sobbed, recounting her terrifying experience. "So many men surrounded me, offered me drinks, fed me food, and asked me for money. I gave them tips, but they weren't satisfied. They kept asking for more, and I was scared. I wanted to leave, but they took me to a small, dark room. Several men surrounded me and stripped. I tried to resist, but they were too strong." Elizabeth broke down, unable to continue. She clung to Henry, crying, "I'm not clean anymore. Henry, I'm not clean. I had no money left. I couldn't find my phone and I didn't know who to call. I managed to run out somehow." Henry patted her shoulder, comforting her. Then he turned and glared at me coldly. "Now, you two have been together behind my back for a long time, right?" I asked calmly. Elizabeth trembled, quickly pushing Henry away. Henry sneered, "I didn't expect you to be such a good actress." "Thanks to you," I responded. After the confrontation, we returned to China, and I filed a lawsuit against Henry. That's when he realized that I had set a trap for him all along. He rushed to find my mother-in-law, who was confused. "Son, what's going on? Everything was fine. Why do you want to divorce Diana?" Henry didn't have time to explain. He asked, "What have you and Diana been doing lately?" My mother-in-law hesitated, but eventually spilled everything under his questioning. She recommended some software to me that could make money. I started by investing a few hundred yuan and made a good profit. But later, when I invested tens of thousands, I couldn't get my money back. The money I used from your credit cards was all invested in that software. But it's not Diana's fault. She was scammed by her friend. Diana also told me she would take full responsibility. Recently, your cousin from your eldest uncle's family is getting married and needs to buy a house. I've used some of the properties and jewelry you transferred to my name as collateral. I couldn't come up with the money at that moment, so I came up with this plan. But Diana assured me that once her funds were available, she would make it up to me. Henry was almost furious and demanded to know how many more things I didn't know about my mother-in-law. She shrank back and said, "Son, you're not still upset about the credit cards, are you? Diana told me to use them freely. I even went to the police to report the money I was scammed out of." Henry snapped, "What else did Diana ask you to do?" My mother-in-law hesitated but admitted, "She just asked me to write some IOUs, saying that I borrowed money from her and also to write IOUs for her after I mortgaged the properties and jewelry you transferred to my name. Since Diana repeatedly promised to help me make up for it, I also wrote an IOU to her in advance." Henry was about to lose his temper. My mother-in-law saw his angry expression and slapped her thigh. "But I mortgaged all your properties. What if you can't get those houses back?" Henry sneered, "Mom, you're really something. You used your son's money to support your brother's family, and you don't even realize when you've been tricked. You really are the best mom in the world." The divorce case was underway in court. When Henry saw William sitting next to me, he was clearly surprised. "Diana, you really know how to surprise me," he said. I replied, "Don't rush. There are more surprises coming." Even though Henry had hired the best lawyers, I trusted William more. In the courtroom, I displayed the surveillance footage, showing the intimate moments between Henry and Elizabeth, played frame by frame in slow motion. The whispered words, the lingering glances, it was clearer than any movie scene. I then presented the marital loyalty agreement, and Henry's face turned ugly. His lawyer questioned my motives, suggesting I had set up a situation where Elizabeth and Henry could be alone under the guise of English tutoring, trapping Henry into infidelity. William calmly asked, "Is that Henry in the video? Is it Henry having an affair? Is it Henry violating the marital loyalty agreement?" The opposing side was silent. I then proceeded to show the chat records between Henry and Elizabeth, along with the evidence of his attempt to transfer marital property. Henry, furious, slammed the table and stood up. "Diana, you've been plotting against me from the beginning, haven't you? You've been so ruthless, setting up trap after trap, making me walk right into it." I laughed. "You thought I was stupid, didn't you, Henry? Actually, I was pretty stupid. Stupid enough to fall for a scumbag like you, with a heart as cold as a beast's, to be blinded by you and marry you." The evidence was irrefutable. Henry had lost completely. But that wasn't the end. I pulled out the IOU my mother-in-law had written to me. "Look at this, Henry. This is the money your mother owes me. It's not much, just a few million. Don't forget to pay me back the money she owes." I continued, and I don't care who your properties are mortgaged to now. Just remember, that's our joint marital property, and I'm entitled to half of it. Henry lost control. He stormed over from the courtroom, ready to hit me. William stepped in front of me, grabbed Henry's wrist, and stared coldly at him. Do you want to go to jail? Henry glared at William. You're in cahoots with Diana? I thought you gave up on her long ago. I didn't expect you to still like her. You're even worse than a bootlicker. William calmly replied, Henry, only an incompetent man judges a woman by her chastity. Henry's eyes were bloodshot with rage. The trial ended and I called out to Henry saying, Do you know what the biggest surprise is? He fixed his gaze on me and I pulled out a fake pregnancy belly from under my dress. Look, it's fake, and I told him. Henry completely lost his composure. Diana, you actually aborted my child? How dare you? How dare you? He looked absolutely terrifying. William stepped in front of me, shielding me from Henry's fury. He was a mistake, I said coldly. Henry laughed maniacally. Diana, you're good, really good. You've been lying to me all this time. Ha 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 ha. You really want to ruin me completely. He lunged at me again, but William restrained him. You deserve to die. You killed my child. I should kill you. I stared at Henry's enraged face, thinking of how my child had looked when he was pulled from the cold river water. It was Henry who truly killed the baby. The division of assets was completed, and I got everything I was entitled to. My mother-in-law called me a beast and accused me of deceiving her, spreading lies everywhere. I remained indifferent. Henry was left heavily in debt, and after a board meeting at his company, he was dismissed from his position. With nothing left, Elizabeth left him too. To avoid being found by Henry or my mother-in-law, I changed both my design studio and the apartment I lived in. I moved to William's neighborhood. One day, as I was carrying some things and stepping into the elevator, I bumped into William. He silently took the items from my hands. I remembered the words I had said to him on the day of our university graduation and asked, Don't you have anything you want to say to me? He paused, then said, I didn't change the lock at my place. That key of yours still opens the door to my house. I asked, And what else? After a long silence, he looked up at me, his deep eyes filled with sincerity. Diana, would you like to have a relationship with me?